All right, so my name is Van Gosse. It's I have to tell my students down at Franklin Marshall every single year. It's not Goose, it's Gosse, which is in English. So, and the thing I did want to say to you guys is that I grew up and my family home was in Lewisburg, over in Union County. So not very far from you. Uh, but um, I am very aware that when I was growing up, which is a long time ago, for a long time, I never heard anything about the coal country or the anthracite. That was never mentioned. People over in Lewisburg, you didn't know it existed. So when I discovered the Molly Maguires, and I found out that the hangings were in Sunbury, the last hangings, executions were just 9 miles down the river, the Susquehanna. I was like, oh, how come I didn't know about this? Why is this history hidden from me? So that's a starting point. So I wanted to ask you, have any of you heard anything about the Molly Maguires?
They were a gang.
Yeah,
There are Irish people who were fighting for workers' rights and stuff, but they're
yeah,
very violently.
very violent. Okay.
So it's
So you
kind
had
of
you've heard of them. Yeah, okay. So the Molly Maguires, people have, I mean, actually what you just said there is like you know quite a bit about them. But since the 1870s, they have been covered over with myth and rumor and stories, and this has lasted a really long time. I remember not very many years ago reading about how one of the top labor union leaders, somebody older than me in the state, someone who had some political power, getting the governor and the legislature to finally grant a pardon to his ancestor, who I believe was Jack Kehoe, the supposed leader of the Molly Maguires, who was hanged by the neck until dead, insisting that he had never done the murder for which he was hanged. And so it's a real tug of war. So what I want to basically tell you about is this book, which is about as good as history ever gets, making sense of the Molly Maguires. And it's a big, thick history book, but it's good because it isn't a simple story at all. So I'm going to start out just by reading the first, like paragraph of the book. In the 1860s and 1870s, the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania, which is where you're sitting, drew national attention for their violence. After a series of assaults and killings, deep-rooted fears of a secret Irish terrorist organization hardened into certainty. 16 men were assassinated, most of them mine officials, and there were numerous beatings and acts of industrial sabotage. The culprits, it was believed, were members of the Molly Maguires, an oath-bound secret society imported from Ireland. Pinkerton detectives were sent into the anthracite district undercover, men of Irish birth with an Irish accent. And the hunt for the Molly Maguires culminated in a series of showcase trials. 20 Irishmen were convicted of a range of heinous crimes and sentenced to be hanged. Their trials and executions were the spectacular climax to a singular episode in American history, one that remains shrouded in ambiguity. And then he goes on to say that they have been depicted in every imaginable way, from sociopaths, which is a nice word for crazy murderers, people with no morality, and terrorists at one end of the spectrum, to innocent victims and proletarian revolutionaries, working class heroes, actually, at the other. But ever since the 1870s, one specific narrative has been dominant, that the Molly Maguires were inherently evil Irishmen who terrorized the anthracite region for 2 decades before being brought to justice by the heroic exploits of James McFarland, a Pinkerton detective. Okay, so that's how the book begins. Now, what I have to move on to is 2 pages later. And what he says. And this is really something. Historians can never know for certain who and what the Molly Maguires were, and to accept the hostile accounts of contemporary observers at face value is at best naive. And by contemporary observers, he means, first of all, paid informants, men who, for for real money, or because this is the way they're going to save their necks, tell stories, slant the truth, or make things up, or journalists looking to, you know, I mean, journalists can say anything they want and publish it, especially in an atmosphere where the Irish Catholics are seen as inherently violent and dangerous. And that is how much, a very large part of America saw them at that time in the 19th century. Now, then he goes on this, on the right, he says, this is a problem. The Molly Maguires themselves left virtually no evidence of their existence, let alone their names and motivation. We don't have someone saying, who somehow survived 40 years later saying, okay, I'm going to tell you what was really going on here. We really don't know. Supposedly, I mean, they must have existed because we do have, this is what I wanted to put up on the screen. Let me see if you can see this. We have this. Let's see, yeah. This is the list of mine officials, political leaders, mostly, mine company officials who were killed, including one, a mine watchman in Shamokin. There was violence for sure, but we don't know much more than that for sure. We can't say that every one of those men that was hanged was a Molly Maguire. And the claim was, and all of these, the witnesses who testified said, well, they're a secret society. When I say secret society, we're not talking like a fraternity at a college. We're talking, oath bound, like I guess you could say sort of like the mafia, except it's not a criminal organization. It's like you will under no circumstance ever describe this organization. The claim was that they were inside a public organization which still exists today, the Ancient Order of Hibernians. John, do you have an AOH group in Shamokin or in the area by any chance? AOH?
Not sure. I assume there probably is, but I'm not positive.
Okay, it's no big deal, but I mean, the St. Patrick's Day Parade in New York City, which I suspect you guys may have heard of, is organized by the Ancient Order of Hibernians. This is the great traditional Irish fraternal society. And they had lodges all around the region where you are. And what was claimed in court was that inside those AOH lodges was this secret group of very violent men. This is, this is as much as we can say for sure. There were these killings. There were probably, there was a lot of places, there were, these men knew how to use explosives. Miners can know how to use explosives. I will note that everywhere in the world you look, whether in Russia or South Africa or the American West, miners have tended to be one of the most militant and politically radical group of workers in the world. That's just a given. I think it's because of the conditions of the work, because it's so dangerous and it requires so much solidarity among the workers themselves. And I mean, if you looked at the total number of men killed in mine collapses in the US, we're talking a lot. So, and it's incredibly exploitative. So we know they existed. We know this happened. I don't have any trouble at all calling this a form of class struggle. This is workers against, the foremen and the employers. The one other thing that now I want to talk, I'm showing you how complicated this history is, not like the whole story. Okay. What puts a special angle on it is the ethnic element. The most miners actually then, and in many places within the mine itself, there's a hierarchy. There's the person who really knows how to put the charges to, blow up a section of coal face or whatever it is. And then the people who work for him, and then the breaker boys, go over to Eckley Miners Village, the 8-year-olds sitting on top of huge chutes, picking out the rocks from the coal. So the mine officials and the most skilled workers tended to be Englishmen and especially Welshmen. And the Welsh and the Irish have had historically very bad relationships. The Welsh are fiercely Protestant. And a lot of the violence and the tension here was between the Irishmen, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, who they are at the bottom, and the Welsh and English above them. So there's a very strong ethnic and religious element to this, but that does not explain it. It's basically, in my view, certainly, and it is about workers and the exploitation and their very violent response, like we're going to push back against you. So that is sort of the setup for who they were. And, at a certain point, the coal and iron companies, which are enormously powerful in Pennsylvania, hire detectives, men who appear to be who are Irish, to go in and infiltrate, and then come out and say in court, I saw him do this, I saw him plant that bomb, I saw him beat this man to death or shoot this mine official, and then that's it. The juries convict them. I actually want to note here, this is something that's always stuck on my mind as a Pennsylvanian. Into the 1930s, which I know sounds a long way away, but not so much for me. There was an entire separate state police force called the Coal and Iron Police. This is a state police force paid for by the coal and iron companies. They paid for them, and their job was to beat heads in places like where you are now. And they were finally got rid of them in the 30s during the New Deal era. But the Eastern European workers, who in the steel towns, they're mostly Europeans, they call them the Cossacks, because and they were a state police force. They weren't private police. So they had the state behind them, and their job is to break a strike through violence. So this is a rough world. Now, I'm coming toward the end of this. What this book did, which is for me very fascinating, was he said, well, who are these people really? Let's go and look at where they come from, not look at the US. Let's consider what kind of Irishmen are they, and where did they get this from? So in Ireland, from about 1760 to 1850, a whole tradition developed around the island of secret societies that carry out, and I don't have anything to put up, what academics have made up a term, retributive, which is a nice way of saying vengeance, retributive violence. You do this to us, we do that to you. In Ireland, the subjects of this retributive violence, which was very well known, were landlords, but especially the people who work for the landlords, the bailiffs and agents who collect the rents and throw people, desperately poor people, out of their, off their land. And there was a lot, of all kinds, killing, somebody you kicked off the land so they can pasture sheep and cows. Well, those sheep and cows end up dead, and somebody gets his head punched in, and somebody who made a deal with the landlord. There were three major groups sort of successively. There were the white boys, that's one word, white boys. That does not refer to someone being white or skin color, which had no meaning in Ireland at the time. White boys, I don't know. And these are groups that would tend to dress up and put on costumes. The ribbon men, white boys, ribbon men, and then eventually the Molly Maguires. And apparently Molly Maguire was a kind of mythical Irish woman who basically said, where is the bread for my children? How do I feed these starving children? So
Appreciate it, guys. I can't wait to read it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the Molly Maguires would dress up. They, put on something to shield their identity, black or white paint over their faces. They'd cover themselves up, and they would go and, do some damage. Now, so this is a powerful secret society tradition of rural violence that gets imported into America. And what this historian, this great historian, Kevin Kenny, who's at New York University, said, well, actually, I mean, the Molly Maguires are almost a fairly unique version of this Irish retributive justice being brought to America. There are not any other examples. Why is that? Okay, so this is where my talk gets to. It turns out, he looked at the names, and it turns out that to the extent you take the men who were tried or named in all these trials, and you trace them back, a lot of that's by names, because people don't come from one part of Ireland, they come from a particular county. And if you were Irish and you could talk to your great grandparents, they would say, no, we're not, we're from Kerry, we're from West Cork, we're from Meath. They would know exactly where they were from, not from Ireland as a whole. It turned out that to the extent we can identify people who probably were Molly Maguires, a really large percentage of them were from Donegal in Northwest Ireland. The most absolutely, when you read about this, I mean, as poor can be, starving poor, Irish speaking, not English speaking. And if you've ever heard the Irish language, it sounds, the one time I heard it in Ireland, first time I heard it, I'm going to say this, it sounded like Chinese. It was sing song. It was completely unlike English. So the most Irish speaking, desperately poor, way out on the Atlantic in Donegal. Donegal's the northwest part of Ireland. So this is where I'm going to conclude. The names, this is how they do it. O'Donnell, Gallagher, Sweeney, Boyle, Duffy, McGeehan, and Mulhern. O'Donnell, Gallagher, Sweeney, Boyle, Duffy, McGeehan, Mulhern. Those are not names. You don't find those names in West Cork, where I've spent most of my time, or maybe even in Mayo, where my people were from, County Mayo, also very poor. So he said, actually, it's this particular, very distinctive part, poorer than almost anywhere else, Irish speaking in Donegal. That's where these Mollies came from. They called them, we called Mollies. And they seem to, that's what makes them kind of distinctive. So that's what I wanted to tell you about. It's an example of, an historian going and saying, well, let's figure out who these people really are. Where are they coming from? And that's what we know, other than all this testimony, which is, a very mixed bag. And the fact that 20 of them were hanged by the neck until dead. If I could share screen, I was going to show you. So this is the final thing that is wild. I don't know if you've ever heard of Sean Connery, the actor. He was the first James Bond. So, you've heard of James Bond, right? Well, the first James Bond movies, the first 10 or so, and it made him an international star. He's James Bond. You know what I'm talking about, right? As cool as can be. He's English. He's a spy. He dresses well. Well, Sean Connery was a dirt poor Irishman, grew up in Scotland. When he stopped making the Bond movies in 1970, he made a movie called Molly Maguires, and it was shot in the Eckley Miners Village near you, and it's really good. It's not strictly accurate. I mean, it's a movie. It's a Hollywood movie, but it is actually. I was going to show you a scene from it. The scene where the guy who is, the agent of the Pinkertons, who's an Irishman, comes into a bar, and there they are, and he's going to prove himself. It's a great scene, but I can't figure out how to share screen. But if you want to know more, a sort of an idea of what this was like, that movie, Molly Maguires, it's a good movie. I just want to throw that in.
So obviously like, Donegal would be like a part of that, but
Yeah.
I'd like to know if that is a part of Northern Ireland today, or is that like in the Republic of Ireland?
That's a very fair question. Donegal is part of the Republic. It is right next to the and when people call the North, people in the Republic just say the North or Northern Ireland. It's right next to it. So if you're very close to Derry. So when things happen in Derry, like Bloody Sunday in 1972, when British paratroopers shot to death 13 innocent civilians, maybe you heard of that? It's one of the huge event. I was just talking to someone I've met who grew up in Donegal, who would have been about, what would she have been, about 12. And it was, like 25 miles away or something, So a lot of Republicans come from Donegal, if you know what I mean by Republicans, IRA. Very strong traditions there. In fact, a very famous, what would have been called a Fenian martyr, someone who was executed for the British because of the activities he'd been involved in Britain in that same period. He was an O'Donnell. I mentioned O'Donnell. He had come over to the anthracite where you are and had some connection to the Molly Maguires there. And then he went back to England and engaged in the violent Republican activities in England. So there is some kind of shadowy connection there, but it's very unclear.
It's just the fact that you brought that they spoke Irish still
Yes.
after
Yes.
all these years. That makes me think they're very deep rooted, and that they like would have the will to come to America and still hold those beliefs, and then be upset in the mind to still be controlled by English and Welsh people.
Sorry, it froze for a second there.
Go ahead. So the fact that they still speak Irish makes me think that they might be the cause, or kind of the majority of people who would come to America and still kind of be upset that they're now being controlled by English and Welsh rules still in mind.
Yes. Well, this is part of the kind of what they're it seems like that's the case in the places. So in Ireland, the Irish speaking areas are called the Gaeltacht, and they still exist, but they're the last time I looked, there were about 60,000 people who live in the Gaeltacht. It's a small number, but they still exist. And Irish school children are sent to those places to make sure they learn their native language. The area where these people came from, the Mollies, was overwhelmingly Irish speaking. The west of Ireland, this is one of the things that I never had any idea of. So, when the migration came during the famine, 1840s, right? 1 million people starved to death. Where the starvation is concentrated and where the immigration is concentrated is in the west of Ireland, which was very Irish speaking. So the chances, this was for me a game changer, discovering that if you're walking around an American town or city in the 1850s or 60s and you meet Irish people, the chances are really good that they will be speaking Irish. They're not all speaking English. A lot of them, and they're in some of the trials, the Molly Maguire trials, they had to have translators. So, I'm just, so it depends where you are in Ireland at that point. The southern and eastern parts are much, much more modern and developed and therefore English speaking.
When you're looking at all these different cases, and you kind of made it seem like it would be like a case by case basis.
I mean, in some cases, someone says yes, and there's several different witnesses. It's also part of what complicates it is what else is going on. Is this, well, the term in Ireland is faction fight. A faction fight, like, we're going at you and you're going at us, and in that context, I hit you over the head. Oh, you're dead. Or is this a deliberate assassination that those people actually did carry out? I mean, even in the movie, the movie is a very pro Molly Maguire's movie. The director is someone who had been blacklisted in Hollywood as a communist, So it's a very pro. These are working class heroes. In the movie, they carry out assassinations. Oh, Kevin Kenny is actually quite clear. He says, I'm using the word assassination rather than murder to convey that this is a political act. But even then, we don't know. In some cases, they may have said, oh, this is the Molly Maguire terrorist, and it may have been something more, kind of ordinary, like you insulted me, so I'm going to kill you. I will say this, in another, I got to teach, the only time I've taught Irish American history was in Ireland at University College Cork, because it's not my training. So I had to go and read a lot of stuff. And I read his bigger general history, I think it's him, of kind of Irish American history, and it was really great. This is not someone who is anti-Irish at all. He said, it is an accurate thing that in traditional Irish peasant society, there are very strong traditions of communal violence. There are, of different clans, large family groups gathering and people, having pitched battles. Prior to the coal miners, which is really around the Civil War time, the major group of Irishmen in Pennsylvania, anyone would have said, oh, they'd have said, those guys digging canals for 50 cents a day. 50 cents a day, whatever that would be. I mean, even if what is that in current money? It is the lowest possible pay. The Irish canal diggers who are just moving from place to place were legitimately notorious for their violence. They would fight with each other based on where they came from. The Kerrymen would fight the Corkmen, Irish fighting Irish. So what I'm saying, and this is sort of roundabout, John, is that, there is a willingness to engage in violence. Then when you're in these mining towns, when you're in Schuylkill County especially, and you've got the Welsh over there calling you Paddy and, kicking you, Oh, the scene of the movie I was going to show, it's great because after this fight in this bar, which is basically a setup fight to see if this guy is really who he claims to be, suddenly the cops come in and the chief of police is a Welshman, and he just, he's got his stick and he's knocking people out. So when you bring in the ethnic element, the violence is intensified. I don't know if that's what I'm really saying is it's very hard to tell which of these crimes actually, who did what, when, and where. Some of them appear to be just straight, setups. Get this informer to say what you want so that they hang somebody. What we do know is that Jack Kehoe, who actually was a saloon keeper and involved in politics, we do know that he unequivocally and absolutely affirmed his innocence while standing on the scaffold in, I think, Sunbury. And that's part of why he got a pardon 20 years ago or so. But there's a whole bunch. You go on YouTube, you put in YouTube, Molly Maguires on YouTube, you're going to find a whole lot of music, really good Irish music talking about them in Ireland and the US. So there's a lot. Luke Kelly. Anyway, go ahead.
I wanted to ask your favorite part of history, and then I'll ask the next one after that.
Oh gosh. Well, getting into an archive and finding something that nobody's ever looked at or nobody's ever bothered to notice. It's a little bit like finding a chunk of gold in a river somewhere. It's like I'm looking at this letter from 100 years ago or something, and oh my gosh, look at this. I can do something with this. It's extremely exciting. You know, I mean, look, Northumberland County probably is an historical society. The historical society may have a bunch of stuff sitting there in some personal papers that actually would really, really reveal whether or not one of these assassinations was carried out by that person or anything. Is there like, oh my goodness, now we know more. So that's the most exciting. That's always really exciting to go and look at primary materials. And that also, to be clear, that could just be a newspaper. It doesn't have to be a diary or a letter, which is more private. It could be looking in a newspaper and saying, well, nobody ever noticed this. Look at that. I can make an argument based on this evidence that is new, and maybe we'll know more.
Advice to history students.
Well, and this is, I suspect almost anybody that talks to you is going to say, get your hands on some primary materials and decide for yourself what they mean. And they are around you, you know. I mean, the primary materials could be sitting in your house. It could be a family Bible. It could be, some letters that somebody was going to throw away. But and as I said, it could just be old newspapers, which are actually one of my favorite sources is old newspapers. The Sunbury Daily Item could be a great source, or we called it the Daily Bitem when I was growing up. But those are just get your hands dirty, so to speak, and see what you think it means.
Why is history important?
If you don't, I mean, this is a cliche in some ways, if you don't know who you are, and I don't mean you individually, I mean you as a whole people, then you don't know what's going on. And this has a special force in the United States because of the extent to which so many of when I say who we are, I don't mean whether we're Irish American or Italian American or African American. I don't mean like that. We so much is kept. That makes it sound like a conspiracy theory. It's not exactly that. There is so much public ignoring. Now I can make a joke about, it being really obvious that the president of the United States, guess which president I'm talking about, okay? Guess, didn't know who Frederick Douglass was. I hear he's a great guy. You know who I'm talking about, right? Frederick Douglass is one of the most important Americans of the 19th century. People all over the world knew who he was. So someone who makes a big deal of having gone to the University of Pennsylvania, I trust you know who I'm talking about here. And, somebody took the test for him, has no idea. So that level of really sort of who history's bunk, who cares? It's just a bunch of facts. You don't need to know it. That's a real problem. We do need to know this. We do need to know a lot of history to understand, to put it bluntly, the fix we're in. We're in a bad place right now in this country. Things are not good, you know. And part of it is because I don't want to go too far on this, but I mean, what do you think the slogan "Make America Great Again" means? When was it great? I mean, I had some ideas. There's times when I thought it was great, but what exactly does that slogan refer to? That's a slogan that implies a certain history. So, what history does that refer to? That's why we need to know history. Versions of that have been going around since Reagan. Okay, what they refer to a particular version of the country that you could roughly say was sort of the 1950s. Everybody knew their place, and so I mean there is a sort of a mythologized idea of when things were great. Um, and a lot of people were not so visible or kept their mouths shut, so to speak. That's what I think that refers to.